Hi, I'm Adrian Vincent Amparo, and on behalf of my group, I would like to welcome you for today's lesson. So today's lesson is all about the global divides. But before we begin our in-depth discussion about the topic, let us first present the lesson objectives. Now, imagine being born in a place where your dreams are limited, not by your ambitions, but by your access to clean water, a stable internet connection, or even basic education. Now, imagine another child born miles away in a different country with access to every possible opportunity. Two lives, two futures, but one planet. So allow us to begin our lecture for today. The world is a shared world. People come from different walks of life. We are different in race, places of origin, skin color, gender, faith, and economic status, while some are privileged and some are not. This diversity is what makes the world fascinating. However, in the midst of its compelling beauty, diversity can also cause division. The term global divides is defined as the observed global discrepancy due to diverse economic conditions. This is according to Botor and colleagues in 2020. This is mostly because of the stratification system, a form of segregating and clustering people according to their social affluence, merits, race, and other categories. This is according to Cornerly and colleagues in 2021. Unfortunately, this globally observed social hierarchy still exists today. Countries labeled as the third world are countries that are experiencing extreme poverty. They are the poorest and the underdeveloped countries. This is according to Claus in 2019. Okay. The persistence of the global divide is very much felt in those countries. The third world countries, laborers are being exploited by the upper-class capitalists for profit, which is arguably an inevitable aspect of global capitalism, and according to King in 2018, a new form of imperialism. Now, delving deeper, imperialism is when a powerful country takes over or takes control over weaker countries to use their land, exploit their people and resources to become even richer and more powerful. But this economic global divide worsens the unequal distribution of wealth, assets, and income among nations. This is according to LibreTexts in 2021. The global economy is structured in a way that it benefits wealthier countries. We live in a capitalist society, by the way. Additionally, these nations maintain control over the most advanced technologies, jobs, and they deepen the divide with the poorer countries. An example of this is during the COVID-19 pandemic. Rich countries like the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, and Europe were able to quickly secure millions of vaccine doses, even more than they needed. This greed, they distribute them widely to their populations, and they started their economic recovery earlier. And when you look at poor countries, they had to beg, they had to ask for donations, they had to buy vaccines from wealthy countries, especially in parts of Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, including the Philippines and Latin America. We too experienced the limited access to vaccines. And we had to wait longer for the vaccines to arrive and be distributed in our population. We suffered more deaths, and we had a slower economic recovery. And we had numerous setbacks in our society during that time. Indeed, it was a clear indication of the global divide, where the wealthier nations used their resources to secure advantages, while the poorer nations are being left behind, even in the midst of global crisis. Now, globalization is the reason why the world is increasingly being interconnected. Through the global trade, new opportunities are provided. However, the global expansion of the economy increases the global divide. Why? Because it enriches the revenue of dominant countries with large production systems while suppressing the wages of the laborers. No? Again, this is according to Sage Publications in 2017. Elaborating further on my example, a 2023 study by the Aberdeen University and Transform Trade revealed that these global fashion giants are engaged in unfair practices against garment factories, particularly in Bangladesh, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. The research, which surveyed around 1,000 factories, found that many brands paid suppliers below the production cost, despite rising global inflation. Factories reported order cancellations, payment delays, and forced price reductions. This situation exemplifies the global economic divide, where the wealthy multinational corporations are benefiting at the expense of vulnerable laborers in poorer countries.
Many theories have been developed to explain global stratification or the unequal distribution of wealth and power among countries. These theories seek to answer why some nations are rich while the others remain poor. What makes some parts of the world develop faster economically speaking than the other is depend on which theories you're using to explain the world. And one of the two main explanations for global stratification is modernization theory, rooted from the structural functionalist approach. This theory proposed that rich countries are wealthy because they are able to adapt to the technological advancement and industrialization, developing their economic practice earlier. In contrast, poor countries remain poor because they did not develop these modern values and instead continue to follow traditional beliefs and practices that hinder their economic progress. They are either unwilling or incapable to embrace industrialization and new technologies. According to Hoiland 2022, the theory argues that poor nations miss out the benefits of major historical events such as the Columbian Exchange or the spread of goods, technology, and education between Europe and Columbus, and Industrial Revolution, where new technologies including the steam power and mechanization allow countries to replace human labor with machines. Nations that didn't industrialize are left behind, which Hoiland emphasized as the biggest barrier to growth. In the widely read non-humanist manifesto, Rostow states that once the foundational components are established, including the infrastructure, industrial capacity, and social institutions, a country experiences rapid period of economic growth or take-off. Rostow's version of modernization is that if you invest capital in better technology, they eventually raise production enough that there will be more wealth to go around, as well as the overall well-being will improve. Botor et al. 2020 exemplified that a competent bureaucracy which guarantees citizen welfare and political stability will inevitably move a country forward and help overcome poverty. On the other hand, while modernization theory is developing, a contrasting idea called dependency theories was also spreading. Due to the idea that stress poor nation depends to the whims and power of rich nation, it came to be known as dependency theory. The first proponents, including Lenin and Bukharin, apply Marxist concept to argue that colonial imperialism is the main cause of poverty in poorer countries. Lenin and Bukharin critiques that even as technology has improved throughout the world, a lot of countries have been left behind. Some critics also point out that Rostow markers are inherently Eurocentric, emphasizing only the economic progress and blaming the poor for not accepting the changes, putting the fault on their cultural values and traditions, rather than focusing on what poor countries are doing wrong. Dependency theories emphasize how poor countries have been wronged by richer nations. It also points to historical factors like colonialism and ongoing global power imbalance as reason why poor countries stay poor. These theories say that as long as a poor country rely on rich countries for economic support and access to market, they will struggle to achieve true independence. Furthermore, this theory claimed that modernization theory are only causing the wealthy core nation to exploit the middle and low core nation, which only increase global inequality and make the poor country economy dependent on them. For instance, the World Bank decides who gets loan and what projects are funded. They create labor markets designed to benefit the dominant economies. Just imagine a poor nation have few resources to export to rich countries, but corporation can buy this raw material cheaply and then process and sell them in richer nation. As a result, the profit tend to bypass the poor countries. Moreover, dependency theory raises question, why can't we understand why rich nations are rich without realizing that those riches came at expenses of another country being poor? In a nutshell, modernization theories contend that low-income countries need modern ideas, technology, and institutions, while dependency theories and other world system theories contend that poor countries face exploitation, domination, and economic distortions because of their dependence on rich countries. The solution to global divide depends on which theory are considered more accurate after all.
The period known as the Cold War was a political framework that was specified by two distinctive worldviews representing the dominant groups of countries. Moreover, the three worlds model of geopolitics contends in the middle of the 20th century as an approach for organizing multiple players associated with the Cold War. The roots of the notion are multifaceted, but historians typically acknowledge this to the French demographer Alfred Savy, who developed the Third World Statement in a 1952 article entitled Three Worlds, One Planet. Within the initial framework, the powers of the capitalist and its comrades, particularly in places across Western Europe, Japan, and Australia, were designated as the First World. It embedded industrialized nations that corresponded with the United States after World War II and were generally distinguished as the Western Bloc, in which they defined themselves as Free World or the Western World. It underscores their devotion to a capitalist economy and people-centered governance, where it authorized the people to elect deserving leaders. On the other hand, the Second World nations were composed of the communist Soviet Union and Eastern European satellites, which had their independent government but were united under the compelling influence of the Soviet Union. It is a less industrialized state, commonly identified as the Eastern Bloc, consisting of a cluster of nations that were compatible with the communist socialist system throughout the Cold War. This bloc covers the nations composed of countries like several Asian communist countries that were bound within China's political sector. Eastern and Central Europe, for example, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Balkans. Furthermore, the Third World pertains to the remaining countries that need to focus on development and are not incorporated into the latter blocks for its functions to mark countries that withstand extreme poverty, troubled economic growth, poor educational conditions, limited utilization of natural resources, and financial crisis. It is more often labeled in line with the conditions of least developed or low-income countries. This emphasized the divergence between the Western Bloc, headed by the United States, and Eastern Bloc, coordinated by the Soviet Union. Concerning this current period, the leading economies of the West are still regarded as First World. However, the term Second World has shifted into the most outdated following the demise of the Soviet Union. Differing from the Third World, which was closely linked and retained recognition as the developing world. Given that it is bound to the geopolitical context of the Cold War, it is deemed outmoded by the modern organizations. Nevertheless, this term appears to categorize countries based on economic standing, and political unions.
So we now know what are the concepts behind the global divides, as well as its negative effects. Now, the question is, as a society, what can we do to address these gaps? In 1980, the Independent Commission on International Development Issues, led by a former West German chancellor named Willy Brandt, published an international policy report which is titled North-South, a Program for Survival. This international policy report aims to address the gaps between the rich and the poor. Nowadays, this report is popularly known as the Brandt Report. Substantially, the report clustered countries in the Northern Hemisphere that are economically advantaged and have lower populations, in contrast from those in the Southern Hemisphere. This produced an imaginary border or line called the Brandt Line. This is according to Botor and colleagues in 2020. This document argues that the global North and South's prosperity lies in the refinement of the current global economic model. Furthermore, the Brandt Report also placed an emphasis on mutualism, that helping poor countries is not an act of charity, it is an act of survival. The Brandt Report cited the need for an international economic system that will preside over states' taxation on certain items, such as the international commons, to raise funds in helping the poor countries. The Brandt Report calls for international cooperation to regulate these areas fairly to prevent overuse, pollution, and monopolization. The report also emphasized managing overpopulation and stressed that every human being has the right to basic essentials, including food, clean water, shelter, healthcare, education, employment, and other basic needs. The document also advocated on the wise usage of technology, including the expansion of the usage of solar energy, as well as the strengthening of the International Monetary Fund or the IMF and the World Bank systems to promote equity, especially on the global south, not just economically, but also holistically in a multidimensional level. Additionally, the report also underscored the importance of environmental sustainability. The Brandt Report asserts that environmental sustainability and poverty alleviation are inseparable challenges that demand unified global action and shared responsibility, because the poor is always affected by the current climate crisis. Moving forward, the Brandt Report also talked about global inequality, about poverty, trade, debt, but not imperialism and colonialism. This is where criticism takes place, because it is peculiar, right? I mean, how can you talk about the gap between the rich and the poor countries and not mention the centuries of exploitation that helped create that gap from the very beginning? But then, maybe it wasn't an accident. The report was written by world leaders. Many of them came from the global north. These people were not historians. They were politicians, diplomats. And if you want global cooperation, especially during the Cold War, the last thing you want is to point fingers at powerful countries and say, instead of talking about the elephant in the room, they focused on solutions, on moving forward and improving the current economic policies, and proposed reforms that are focused on humanitarian aid and trade. But here's one thing: ignoring history doesn't erase its consequences. If you really want justice, real justice and changes, we have to be brave enough to look back, even when it is uncomfortable.
In conclusion, the global divide not only refers to the social hierarchy and economic disparities between the poor and wealthy countries, but also rooted in historical geopolitical conflict like the Cold War. which is the primary cause of the inequalities between global North and South. Understanding the historical event in global divide helped explain why many poorer countries struggle with development today and why rich countries become richer. Theories including modernization and dependency analyze the root of poverty, while the Brandt report offers practical recommendations to address the gap between rich and poor countries. The long-standing inequalities between nations where they clash for wealth and battle for dominance highlighted the social divide that gradually drifted apart for a more equitable world. The proposed approach and vision for tearing down the barriers remains a significant global issue. Achieving global equity, not just economic growth, along with the political and social advancement, leads to a natural transition to break the cycle of poverty and dependency of a nation towards certain economically competent countries.